Hello everybody, we'll just be starting in a minute. And I think we've got everybody now that we were expecting to join us, is that right? Okay, so I think we'll just kick off. I would just, my name is Julie Perrone. I am the stakeholder and communications lead for Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme. And thanks very much for joining us this evening. This is our first online session before we get to in-person events. And we're going to take you through, so we'll just move on to the agenda. So we're going to give you some background. Some of you may have seen some of that background before, but we'll take you back through it. We'll talk about the current flood risk to the area that the scheme covers. Then we'll be looking at the proposed scheme design, and at that point, which includes lots of maps that you'll be able to see, and Alan McGowan, who's works with me at Jacobs as the lead project manager on the scheme, will take you through some of that. And then we'll be moving on to questions, and we'll also look at the environment, what the statutory process is for the scheme, what our other engagement events we've got coming up, and some further information, and then we'll stop again to have some more questions. Also on the call with me, you can see in front of you is Alistair Dawson, who's Falkirk Council's Infrastructure Projects Manager. He'll be taking you through some of the slides as well. So we'll just move on. I'm going to touch on now onto some housekeeping. So the meeting is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded and you want to have your camera off, then feel free to do so. That's just allow us to take a minute of the meeting, and we'll also post the recording on the website, the Grangemouth Flood Scheme website. I'm asking you to keep your microphones switched off if you can. That just helps us with some background noise, but of course you can feel free to put your microphone on if you want to ask a question. You can ask a question by using the chat function, which is a little speech bubble at the very top of your screen. Just type your question in there and we'll get to it as we're asking it, or you can use the raise your hand option, which is the little hand at the top of your screen. Click it on and then we'll come to you and ask a question, or just put your hand up if you've got your camera on so that I can see it. I'd ask that everybody is respectful when we go through the presentation and when asking questions. That allows us to be able to get to questions quicker and make sure that we answer everything you want to know. And as I've said before, we'll stop halfway through just for questions, particularly because that features the scheme defences and maps of different areas that the scheme has covered. And then again at the end to catch anything that you might have missed. And now I'm going to hand over to Alistair, who's going to take you through the scheme background. Alistair, over to you.
Thanks very much, Julie. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As Julie said, my name's Alistair Dawson. I'm Infrastructure Projects Manager at Falkirk Council. So I have responsibility for taking forward a number of large capital projects, which includes some of the larger roads improvement schemes and, of course, the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme, which we're here to speak about this evening. The Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme continues to be developed by Falkirk Council in conjunction with a range of external technical consultants. Obviously, we've got some of those along with us this evening. And this proposed scheme, if it is approved, would be the largest in Scotland and indeed one of the largest in the UK. So throughout tonight's session, we'll be giving you much more information. And as Julie said, there's information available on the scheme website, and there'll be other ways to make contact with the team over the coming weeks that we'll remind you of later in the evening. Tonight's session is the latest in actually a series of opportunities that we've been able to give members of the public to view the scheme proposals. The latest events have been scheduled to fall just immediately prior to the project moving into the next development stage, which will happen in the coming months. And I'll obviously provide more information on that later on. So along with a series of public engagement events being held next week, which are the face-to-face events, there will be an accompanying virtual exhibition room, which will be available. And with, as it says on the bottom of the slide, there have been a number of opportunities in previous years and ongoing engagement with communities over a number of years using a number of different formats. Could you just go to the next slide, please, Alan? So, broadly speaking, I think everyone is aware of the kind of devastating impacts that flood events can have on communities. News coverage of flood events has been fairly common in recent years, whether it's specific to Scotland, elsewhere across the UK, or even some international examples. I'm sure most of you will have seen the images from Brecon just last October, when Storm Babette caused extensive flooding in the town. That particular flood event, that storm event, affected a community that's only 65 miles north of Falkirk and could easily have affected a different part of Scotland had that weather system landed in a different part of the country. So although Grangemouth hasn't experienced one of these more extreme flood events in recent years, there are historic records of large flood events in the 1920s and 1950s or 60s, and there's been several smaller flood events occurring on a quite regular basis in more recent years, and the list on the right-hand side of this slide just lists out some of those events. Even these smaller flood events frequently impact residential properties, local transport connections, and can also affect commercial operations within the docks or industrial complex. So just to highlight one or two specific examples, the more recent examples, in August 2020, there was actually some monitoring equipment on the River Avon, and that recorded the highest ever level on the River Avon in, I think it's over 100 years. Polmont Bean Cross area, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the impact some flood events have had on several occasions actually in the Bean Cross area in recent years. And one of the other examples on the list is Stirling Road. So Stirling Road, Camelin, close to Falkirk Golf Club and the bus depot, is regularly overtopped by the River Carron close to Dorritor Bridge. So the scheme that we're looking at has been designed to protect these communities from flood events which are classified as having a medium probability, but which will lead to a very high impact. And it's equally important to recognise that although the scheme is designed to offer flood protection from that larger size event, it will also protect communities, buildings, other assets from numerous smaller and more frequent events that do occur and are currently experienced. We'll come back to that a bit more in some of the later slides. So Grangemouth itself and the surrounding communities are actually quite unique in terms of flood risk. The town and surrounding areas are naturally quite flat and low-lying, so they're vulnerable from coastal flooding if there's a particularly high tide. And the peak of high tides can be associated with weather systems and can be influenced by storm surges. Sometimes the extent of flooding, of coastal flooding, isn't just confined to the industry and port along the estuary foreshore, but can actually be experienced quite far upstream. And I think some of you will recognise that on any given day of the week, you can stand at the Grange Barn or on the Carron as far up as Carron Shore, and you can actually see that the tide is in or the tide is out. Some people might not actually be aware how often previous high tides have come close to overtopping the banks of some of these rivers and these watercourses. But the town is also bounded by 3 rivers. We've got the River Carron to the north, the River Avon to the south, and the Grange Barn flowing through the middle of Grangemouth. And that's obviously fed from some smaller tributaries that come down through Polmont, West Quarter, and other parts of the district. And if you actually think about the catchment area for those 3 watercourses, it's really, really large. It extends all the way from the Campsie Hills in the west and the Carron Valley, all the way around Upper Braes towards Slamane, Avonbridge and places, and those other towns and villages to the south of the Falkirk Council District. So there's a vast, vast area that can actually collect that rainfall. And obviously, it all has to flow downstream towards the estuary. When these really large rainfall events occur in the upper catchment, the water makes its way down the river system, spills out onto the floodplains and undeveloped land, but where there isn't capacity for the water, then other areas can become more and more vulnerable. And it's these instances when homes, businesses, road networks and other assets can become blocked by those fluvial floodwaters. So as it says in the plan, on this slide, the proposed scheme would consist of around 17 miles or 28 kilometres of defences and all the associated works that are required to provide the protection and the resilience from these fluvial or tidal coastal flood events. Next slide, please, Alan. As it says in the slide, the need for flood risk management measures in the Falkirk and Grangemouth area, across the whole area, was originally identified through the 4th Estuary Flood Risk Management Strategy way back in 2015. Now in Scotland, flood risk management plans are produced for 14 what are known as local plan districts covering the entire country. And if you want to find out a little bit more about those districts and how the plans are developed, information is available through the SEBA website. At the time, this strategy for Falkirk for the 4th Estuary was developed, and the strategies were produced for all the other local plan districts. There were a range of mitigation measures proposed for each district. And this can range from flood warning systems, general raising awareness about flood risk, and assisting communities protect themselves, all the way through to the more formal and engineering measures required from flood protection schemes. And actually, of all the flood schemes from across the whole of Scotland that were put forward to the Scottish Government for prioritisation, the Grangemouth scheme was the one which came out top and is ranked as the #1 priority for flood protection scheme in Scotland. Once it's complete, it's anticipated the scheme will offer protection to over 2,500 residential properties and over 1,000 non-residential properties. Next slide, please, Alan. I want to just briefly mention a little bit about climate change. So climate change predictions show that the UK is already seeing more frequent and more extreme rainfall events, which lead to more and more flood events. And as a result, it's likely that defences will become even more desirable in the future as the impact of more regular storm or flood events are felt by more and more communities. As I mentioned earlier, the scheme is being designed to protect against all flood events up to and including the medium probability event. This is sometimes known as a 1 in 200 year event, but I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean that this flood event won't happen for 200 years, and it doesn't mean that it'll only happen once in 200 years. The flood risk is simply a statistical function which expresses the likelihood or the probability that any given location will experience flooding in a year and the impact that the particular size or magnitude of that flood event would cause. So it's the likelihood and the impact. And if we could just zoom in on, I think Alan, we could probably zoom in on the left-hand side, the first plan, if possible. I appreciate that flood risk and the terminology that's used in the flood risk community can be quite confusing if you're not familiar with it. But hopefully the maps in this slide and tonight's presentation will begin to help the viewers to understand that a little bit more clearly. So in the flood risk community, we actually use a range of probabilities. 1 in 200 is one that you may have heard, but we actually use a whole range of probabilities from 1 in 2 or 1 in 5, all the way up to 1 in 1,000, which thankfully is pretty rare. So the two plans on this slide show the flood extent for some of the smaller flood events, which would have a higher probability of occurring, as well as the design flood event, which is being taken forward through this project, which is the medium probability event. So this first extract shows the flood predictions for 2030 along the River Carron through the Carron Shore area. Firstly, I want to draw your attention to the purple areas, which are the areas which would see flooding most frequently, typically a 1 in 5 year event. So quite a high probability, but thankfully not particularly deep floodwater and something that's generally contained within the existing floodplain. Although Stirling Road, right at the west end of this extract, does very frequently become affected by flooding from the River Carron. If you then look at the blue areas, these are the additional areas which, in addition to the purple areas, would be affected by a 1 in 50 year event, so one that happens less frequently. It's not quite as high a probability, but would have a greater impact. And finally, the green area depicts the largest design event, the medium probability 1 in 200 year event. And you can see that the extent of flooding in this event is further, and hopefully you could appreciate that the depth of the floodwater would be more than what would be seen in the purple event, or an event that affected just the purple and blue areas. The bigger the event, the wider the area and the greater the depth of the flooding. And Alan, if we could scroll across yet to the second extract. This extract just shows more of the kind of Grangemouth town centre area. And again, I'll point out some of the areas, particularly areas in purple, which are vulnerable to to flooding in those higher probability events. Specifically, Alan, you could maybe point to the Beancross area at the south. So that's A9, Cadgers Brae, Klondike Garden Centre, and the hotels on both sides of the road. If we go to the west, that purple area at Lauriston Road is close to W.H. Malcolm's logistics business. And there are also a couple of residential cottages adjacent to that. To the right, we have the banks of the River Avon, close to the industrial sites. And maybe most significantly, right at the top of the plan, is the middle of Grangemouth, where there are several streets in the centre around Bowness Road and Abbots Road, which are prone or vulnerable to flooding in a 1 in 5 year event. And again, just like the previous plan, if you look at the escalation of the flood events, the size and impact of the flood events, the purple, you then add on the blue, and finally add on the purple, the blue, and the green altogether, would be the extent of a flood event for that medium probability event, or indeed what that is the event to which we're designing the project to protect communities against. Appreciate it's a little bit difficult, but if anybody's any questions, we'll try and come back to that later on. So just wanted to give a bit of an overview of some of the facts and figures about the proposed schemes. The first bullet clearly covers the extent of the scheme, those communities that are vulnerable to flood risk. And the little infographic on the right-hand side just confirms those numbers that were mentioned previously. 2,760 residential properties are at risk, but also around 1,200 commercial and non-residential properties across the entire scheme area. And this is obviously businesses, but also things like schools, churches, community centres, and other facilities. Obviously, the Port of Grangemouth and the wider petrochemical industrial complex are key national infrastructure assets, and being in close proximity to the Forth Estuary and sitting at the mouth of the three rivers that we described earlier, these are obviously vulnerable to flood risk, both from tidal or from fluvial events. In total, there are around 23 kilometres of the road network which would be affected by the 1 in 200 or the medium probability flood event. And just to take a moment or two to look at the costs and benefits of the scheme. Obviously, as many of you will be aware from previous communications and press coverage, the estimated cost of this project is considerable. It's currently sitting at between 450 and 672 million. And I would just point out that it is standard practice for projects of this scale and complexity to have a range of costs rather than to home in on a single figure. So that's quite normal at this stage of the project to have a range in that magnitude. Falkirk Council are currently working and continue to work with Scottish Government to confirm the availability of national budgets. And the government have recently confirmed that they will establish a task force to be looking at this in more detail. We wouldn't anticipate necessarily having the full budget made available all at once, but we have made provisions for smaller packages of works to be funded, which would align with a phased approach to the construction activities. So we would hope, for example, that we would be able to carry out defences in maybe the residential areas first, and then gradually move downstream and out towards the estuary and the more industrial areas. But it isn't just all about the cost. It's obviously about the benefit side of things as well. Clearly, the cost of £500 million is, or more, is a huge investment. But by assessing the benefits a project delivers for a set level of investment, you can begin to compare the kind of value for money element. So economic benefits are generally benefits that can be quantified in monetary terms, and all flood schemes across the country use an industry standard economic assessment criteria to estimate the damage costs that can be avoided as a result of implementing flood protection measures. The calculations will include things like the clean-up and repair of properties, including furnishings and belongings, and that's obviously both for the residential and the commercial properties. But it also includes damage to vehicles, the cost of emergency services responding to a flood incident, and even things like risk to life and even the mental health costs, because sometimes those tangible benefits aren't immediately obvious to viewers and to people reading the documents that we would put out. So the economic benefits for the Grangemouth scheme are currently estimated at £2.4 billion. The economic benefits are therefore far, far greater than the projected cost to deliver the entire scheme. And in general terms, if a project has a benefit cost ratio greater than 1, the project is expected to deliver a positive net present value to its client or the investors for that project. This particular scheme currently has a benefit cost ratio of 4.3, so significantly higher than 1. But ultimately, as the bottom bullet point says, any flood protection scheme is there to support the local community to be more resilient, to recognise the flood risk and the impact that a flood event could have, and to implement defence measures proactively before the next event has those devastating impacts. Next slide, please. And again, please, Alan. Thanks.
Has
Mine
that
hasn't-
moved on, Alistair?
Mine hasn't moved on yet, no.
It should be showing just the title slide.
Sure, that's it now. It flashed up on the next slide and then went back to the title slide. It's maybe just a slight delay. There we go. That's the one. Thank you. So this plan simply shows, in broad terms, the locations where flood defences are proposed, from Stirling Road in the west all the way to the industrial complex in the east, along the alignment, the watercourse of the River Carron at the north, the River Avon at the south, and the Grangeburn through the centre. And we will delve into this in more detail in some of the slides that are coming up in Alan's part of the presentation. The graphic on the right, again, is just intended to help visualise or explain the size and frequency of different flood events that I spoke about earlier. And hopefully this graphic, and obviously these slides will be available after the meeting, hopefully this graphic and the content of tonight's presentation begin to demonstrate that the smaller flood events occur more frequently. And although there's a probability, there is still a probability of larger extreme events happening, they are fortunately a little less common. The Grangemouth flood scheme is designed to offer protection from all those lower events, all the way up to and including a 1 in 200 year flood event. and that's both from a fluvial event or from a coastal event. Next slide, please, Alan. So climate change obviously brings a lot of uncertainty. We know that there will be an increasing effect as climate change occurs, and we've already started to see more frequent flooding events. But there's obviously a bit of uncertainty about how quickly climate change will happen and how severely climate change might affect communities that are vulnerable to flood risk. So as a result, the Scottish Government and SEBA have encouraged local authorities to promote flood schemes to take a more adaptive approach. This means that although we're designing for what we already know this year, 2024, and for a scheme that would be built in maybe the 2030s, we also take account for how climate change might impact the flood requirements for future generations. And the image on the right-hand side is to help begin to illustrate some of our current thinking and our current plans and ideas. So typically, a flood wall is not just what you see above ground. The portion above ground is generally quite small in comparison to what sits below that. It has to include a foundation which is capable of withstanding the force of water pushing against the full height of the wall. So if we were to design that foundation today, it would be as small and efficient as it possibly could be. But if then in, say, 50 years' time, future generations were to come back and say that as a result of climate change, these walls are no longer high enough and actually the community is now at flood risk again, then there might be a desire at that later date to increase the height of walls and provide more resilience to that community. And if that foundation was the smallest size possible when we build it in 2024, 2030, whatever the year is, that would mean the future generation would need to come along, dig out everything that had gone before, and reinstate a larger foundation to withstand the forces against a larger wall. So instead, the current thinking is that we were proposed to design and construct foundations of the walls that are slightly larger than they would normally be required for the lower height of the wall, and that these foundations are already designed to accommodate future adaptation if that was required. So this would mean that should there be a requirement to increase the height of the wall in 50 or 70 years' time, then only the only new expenditure would be that portion above ground. Obviously, it'd be far simpler, far cheaper, and far quicker to adapt to future needs, but that would only happen if that point became apparent at some date in the future. So the walls are designed to have a lifespan of 100 years without any major maintenance and would typically last longer than that period. But by building in slightly larger foundations at this stage, we actually can improve the performance and the lifespan of what might be required in the future and minimize future disruption should there be adjustments required at a future date. Thanks, Alan. And actually, I think, Alan, it's at this point I actually hand to you to take the next couple of slides.
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Alistair. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yeah, I think initially I'm just going to actually return to just one of the slides that Alistair had shown, just to give some context to what I'm about to go through. And I just really want to use the map on the left-hand side just to kind of discuss in just a bit more detail the locations of defences, because it's, you know, the map shows quite a large area and people might not be familiar geographically with where the defences are located. So I think, as Alistair mentioned earlier, that there's multiple water courses that we're proposing to construct defences on. The main ones being the River Carron, the Grange Burn and the River Avon. But we also have defences on the Westwater Burn, the Polmont Burn, the flood relief channel itself, which is something I'll look at, the Millhall Burn, and along the estuary. So there is a significant number of water courses that contribute to that flood risk that we experience in the Grangemouth and wider area. So just looking at this map and just sort of quickly going through the areas, and I say we will look at each area in a bit more detail. So the River Carron is the blue line that you can see kind of through here, and the first defences that we have are on the River Carron at Stirling Road, around the bus depot and adjacent to Falkirk Golf Course. Further downstream on the River Carron, we have defences in the Carron and Carron Shore area around Park Road, Stenhouse Road, and New Carron Bridge, Beaumont Drive, and the lower part of the Chapel Burn, and some further defences around Dock Street and Gilfillan Place, and slightly further downstream in the River Carron. Again, we have defences in the Glensborough area, Dalgrain Road, and that then leads into kind of flood defences that are almost continuous around the port of Grangemouth, and that includes significant works to the entrance channel on the port, where we're having to replace one of the lock gates because the top of the lock gates is below what would be the flood defence level, and if we don't replace those gates, it provides a path for water to get into the port. On the Westwater Burn and Beaumont Burn around Bean Cross, we've got defences which then lead into the Grange Burn. I'm not sure how familiar people are, but north of the M9, it's the Grange Burn. South of the M9, it's the Westwater and Beaumont Burns, which are two separate watercourses that come together essentially to form the Grange Burn, and we then have defences along Rannoch Park, where the flood relief channel is located, and further downstream following the flood relief channel until it connects to the River Avon, where we have flood defences pretty much on both banks of the River Avon or through the petrochemical plant, and finally there's some defences along the Forth estuary between the River Avon and the Grange Burn, which I just thought it was useful just to come back to that before looking at the more detailed plans, because when we kind of zoom in on the detailed plans, people might not be able to fully appreciate just what areas we're talking about. But before I kind of move on to start looking at those maps in more detail, I just want to kind of go through some of the types of flood defences that you'll hear me talk about when I'm looking at those maps. The type of flood defence we're proposing for Grangemouth isn't just a single type of, whether it's a concrete wall or brick wall. The actual type of defence will vary by location. The proposed appearance of the wall, whether that's brick or concrete or stone, will be suitable to the area that the wall's located in, with some of the kind of plainer finishes, like just plain concrete, being in the industrial areas where the public don't have any access, and they're much less visible. So just quickly kind of running through these photographs. The top left-hand image is a photograph of a patterned concrete wall. So this is when the concrete is poured. It's poured into a liner that has a pattern, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of pattern. This one here is to mimic a kind of stone wall, but you get all sorts of different patterns, and the specific pattern for Grangemouth hasn't been decided. That would be decided in conjunction with the local planning authority. The top image in the middle is a brick-clad flood defence. So this uses bricks on the outside. That's what you see. But the core of the wall will either be steel piles or concrete. And the cladding there is purely a kind of decorative feature to make the wall kind of more appealing than just a plain concrete wall. The top right-hand image is an earth embankment. We don't have a huge amount of earth embankments on the Grangemouth scheme, just because they need a lot of space to construct. The footprint is very large in comparison to a wall, and in most locations in Grangemouth, we have very limited space to actually construct the defences. Now, the embankment shown here is just grass covered. One of the embankments we're proposing, which I'll come into, will actually be sown with wildflower and to replace an existing wildflower meadow where the embankment's being constructed. The bottom left image is an actual image of this is taken looking towards the M9, which is in the background of this, and this is the Polmont burn and West Quarter burn when it comes through under the M9 at the start of the existing flood relief channel. And as you can see here, the existing walls are steel piles with a concrete cap, and we are proposing similar walls, again mainly in the industrial areas where they won't be seen by the public. And the final image at the bottom right here, which we have quite a lot of this type of wall on the scheme, is a stone-clad flood defence. This is very similar to the brick-clad. The stonework is decorative, and the core of the wall will either be concrete or steel piles, but you won't see any of that once the stonework is complete. So just moving on to a couple of other images of defences I'll talk about. The top left-hand image shows demountable flood defences. So in this particular photograph, the demountable defences have been or are in the process of being erected. Normally, none of that would be visible, so the posts and the panels between the posts would be stored, preferably locally, so that they're close by when they need to be deployed, but they would only be erected when a flood was forecast. And we have a couple of areas on the scheme where these demountable defences are being proposed, and it's mainly where we need to maintain day-to-day access, so across maybe a wide road where there's no really any other alternative to maintain access and keep the road open most of the time. We have demountables, but when there's a flood event forecast, these would be erected and the road would be closed. And that's they perform a very similar function to the floodgates shown in the top middle here. Again, these are watertight gates when they're closed. We have quite a number of these on Grangemouth. The majority of them will normally be locked closed, and they're only being provided to allow for future maintenance, whether that's grass cutting or some other type of access. So those gates would be opened when the maintenance is required and then closed again. But we do have other gates that will be open normally to provide access, and then again, when a flood event is forecast, they would be closed. The top right-hand image just shows the top of an underground pumping station. So we're likely to have a number of these on the Grangemouth scheme, and these are to deal with secondary drainage issues, and that's water that might get trapped behind the flood defences because they've been erected, and any water that's falling on the land behind the scheme might not be able to drain away, so they would drain through, or drainage would be installed, that any water landing behind the flood defences rainfall would be picked up with the drainage system and would pass through this pumping station, which would essentially pump the water over the wall to prevent any further drainage problems. The bottom left-hand image is a flood defence wall with glass panels along the top. Again, we don't have many of these as part of the Grangemouth scheme. They're normally used where you've got quite high flood defences, but there's views that you would want to maintain. So we have a section of wall with glass panels in it, just between the Stenhouse and New Carron road bridges, just where the flood defence wall in that area is particularly high, and these will provide kind of viewing opportunities. And the final photograph is just a kind of extract of a flow control structure, which I'll talk about when we get to the Grange burn kind of slide. But what we're proposing to do is to put greater control on flows in the Grange burn, divert more water along the flood relief channel, and therefore completely avoid the need for any defences between Rannoch Park and Zetland Park within Grangemouth. But I will come on to that later. But before looking at the maps, as Alistair and Julie mentioned, I think earlier, we have had a number of engagement events before. We have had feedback from the public, and I just wanted to go over a few things that have changed since the last really engagement sessions that we had. And I think previously, in fact, not just at the previous engagement sessions, but during the whole kind of process of developing this scheme over the last number of years, a major concern, rightly so, has been the removal of trees. And it's not something that we want to do if we can avoid it. But unfortunately, in some areas, because of the constraints that we have, trees might be one constraint, the position of a building, a structure, underground pipes and utilities. These are all constraints that we have to consider when positioning flood defence walls and other structures. And in some locations, there just isn't space between the source of the risk, so the water course, and the properties that we're trying to protect. The only piece of land that we can possibly construct a flood defence on, is possibly where there's trees. And in that circumstance, it's unavoidable that the trees are going to be affected. We have, spent a long time on this scheme looking at the alignment of the scheme to avoid those impacts. And we have made, is this the kind of speech bubbles in the top left of this image illustrate, we've made significant changes within Zetland Park itself, within the park itself, and I've got slides that I'll show later. We're now down to 9 trees within the park being affected, which is generally where there's the existing bridges and accesses, and we need ramps to access that. But we have changed the design significantly since some of the initial designs, listening to those concerns that have been raised, and we have been able to reduce the number of trees within the park. Just looking at the bubbles below that, which is the area adjacent to the park at Abbots Road. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to reduce the number of trees that are being felled there. It's not from kind of lack of looking at alternatives. I say we presented alternative alignments to a range of consultees, including emergency services and Falkirk Council's roads team and the emergency planning team at Falkirk Council, looking at narrowing Abbots Road and Park Road in order to move the flood defences further away from the trees. But during that consultation, it became apparent that there was significant issues with that. Both, the road would need to become one way, which is it's a main route in and out of Grangemouth. I suppose maybe more importantly, emergency services, fire and rescue, basically told us that they wouldn't be able to access properties if we narrowed it with their high reach equipment, that it needed to be sitting on a road with its outriggers deployed. They couldn't use it if the outriggers would be on the footpath, which basically ruled out the option of narrowing the road, which meant that the flood defences were, literally, through the only location we could construct the flood defences was literally through the roots or through the trees themselves. So whilst we tried to change things there, we weren't able to. And finally, the kind of last point on this slide is the comments before about wanting more engagement on the project, and we believe that we've done that. This is the 4th suite of engagement sessions. We've had in-person and online events. In 2022, we had a mobile exhibition van that toured various locations, and we've we continue to issue newsletters, and over the last 18 months I've had 400 or more than 400 engagements with individual affect people, whether that's property owners or businesses. But I'm now going to move on to look at the maps, the location of the flood defences in more detail. I would stress that with the time that we've got tonight, we don't have a lot of time to spend detail looking through these, but these maps will be available at the in-person events, and I would encourage people, if they can find the time, to come along to those events, because they can speak to members of the team and spend longer looking at these maps. They will also be on our virtual exhibition, which goes live on Monday, and they will also be uploaded to the project website. And on the project website, there's actually an interactive map that shows the same information as this that people can look at. So whilst it might seem that we're quickly going through it tonight, I would hope that with the other opportunities people have to look at these maps, that they can spend more time just considering what's proposed than we'll have tonight. So on Stirling Road, which is on the River Carron, I'm just going to point out the kind of main features, just because we've got a number of these maps to go through. The flood defences take the form of a brick-clad wall on the north side of Stirling Road, and there's a few floodgates to provide access into property. The rear of the bus depot, which is round about here, which is only really visible from on the golf course, is going to be a formed, patterned concrete wall, and there's a flood defence that runs along the kind of west south side of Stirling Road, which is going to be stone clad. There is a car park adjacent to the Dorritor footbridge in here, and access to that car park will be via a kind of ramp that goes up and over the flood defence. And I think if people use this road regularly, they will know that every year or couple of years it is closed due to flooding, and that's primarily, there's a kind of very low spot just around here where my cursor is, where the River Carron comes over and actually floods the road and the golf course. So these defences that we are proposing, together with further improvements to the road drainage, will ensure that this road is kept open during a flood event, for those both more very frequent events that happen every couple of years to the more extreme events that won't happen as often. Moving further downstream to the kind of Carron Shore area around we've got the Stenhouse Road here and the new Carron Road there, and the old Carron Works is sitting in here. So we have an earth embankment proposed along the west side of Park Road and Sainford Crescent, with the bulk of the other walls being constructed being either brick clad or stone clad. I think on the south of the new Carron Works it's stone clad, but it does change to a kind of brick clad wall between the two bridges, and extends slightly downstream of New Carron Bridge behind Beaumont Drive. I think the wall extends as far as the fourth house downstream from the bridge. In addition, we are proposing to replace the New Carron Road Bridge. The Stenhouse Road Bridge will have the demountable barriers that I mentioned earlier constructed at either end. So during a flood event or an extreme flood event, those barriers would be erected and Stenhouse Road will be closed. We did consider something similar for New Carron, for the New Carron Bridge, but if we were to close that bridge during a flood event, the only route that we could probably be certain that would be open during a flood event that crosses, that goes north-south or south-north, would be the M9. There would be no other road crossing, with the exception of Stirling Road, which hopefully would be open as well. The bridge just to the west of Stirling Road. So we felt it was important that we had another route north-south across the River Carron that we could have more certainty would be kept open during a flood event, so that bridge is being replaced. As we move downstream on the River Carron, we have the nursing home people might be familiar with, just at the corner here, where we basically have flood defences that run along the rear gardens of those properties and then run either side of this is a chapel burn that comes into the River Carron here. Now, these flood defences will be brick clad, and they'll be located basically almost following the kind of fence lines of the existing properties. The proposal is that they would actually be on the river side of the existing kind of boundary fences, in order that there's no real impact on the usable garden space that people are using. And further downstream, just on the River Carron, we have a proposed formed concrete wall that runs along the south of Gilfillan Place and along Dock Street and there's a floodgate just to provide access for the owners and users of the stables and the kind of field that's in this bend within the river that's used for horse-related kind of activity. Moving across to the Bean Cross area. So we have the West Quarter burn on this part of the image, the Polmont burn to the east. Both of those, whilst this map kind of indicates that they come together just at the M9, the actual crossing under the M9 is basically two pipes, with the West Quarter burn and the pipe to the left as you look at this image, and the Polmont burn and the pipe to the east. And when they cross under the Polmont burn, when they cross under the M9, the Polmont burn, essentially in normal circumstances, is what flows into the flood relief channel, which you have here, and the West Quarter burn becomes the Grange burn, which heads in a northerly direction towards Zetland Park. So we have the flood defence walls in this location are all predominantly a patterned concrete finish, with the exception of the flood defence walls around Grand Sable Cottage, which is just at the entrance to the cemetery, which the walls in that location will be stone clad to match the existing building. Another key feature of the defences in this area is there's an existing underpass under the A9. Now, some people may, if you're familiar with this area, will have seen that this underpass regularly floods. And in the event that Alistair mentioned earlier in August 2020, what we actually seen happening there was that water spilled out the West Quarter burn, flowed through the underpass under the M9, affected the properties on the north, but then headed in a northwesterly direction and started to affect the properties around Lauriston Road. So with the defences that we're proposing and closing off that underpass, all water will now be directed through the crossing of the M9, which is, when I come on to the next slide, I'll explain why we're having to then divert more water along the flood relief channel. I think the only other thing to point out on this side is with the closure of the underpass, we are going to provide a new traffic light controlled crossing of the A9 to replace that underpass. So looking at Rannoch Park, this is just the other side of the M9 from where we were looking. So we have the Grange burn running kind of south to north, and then we have the flood relief channel that runs along Rannoch Road, crosses under Enchira Road, and then runs in a northeasterly direction. The proposal here is to construct a new flow control structure that I mentioned earlier when we were looking at photographs. And the purpose of this is to limit how much water is then passed forward down into Grangemouth town centre along the Grange burn. I mentioned earlier that because we are blocking the underpass, actually more water is going to pass through the M9. So if we didn't put that control structure in place, we would need flood defences between Rannoch Park and Zetland Park, which we were keen to avoid. So we're diverting more water along the flood relief channel, and in order to accommodate that increase in flow, we're having to build some defences along the flood relief channel. So we're building a formed concrete wall along the north side of the channel. And we are also proposing to refurbish the entire channel. It was constructed in the late 50s, early 60s, and it is in poor condition in places. So we will be refurbishing the entire channel as part of the scheme. And this is just a continuation of the flood relief channel further downstream along Hoe Flats Road, where we have formed flood defences, patterned concrete around the junction of Enchira Road and Hoe Flats Road, and then further east, which is hard to see on this map, but say if you access it online, that there is a light grey line along here, which is a bare sheet pile wall, and that's just because we're starting to enter into the kind of industrial areas, and that's been deemed suitable for those areas. And as I mentioned, the flood relief channel on this slide as well will also be refurbished. Moving along, the flood relief channel is just to the north of this image, where it comes into the and joins the River Avon. This is quite a complex, or very complex area in the scheme. You have the Mill Hall burn that is running kind of from the bottom left image up towards the River Avon. We have the River Avon. We just see the kind of corner of it here where it passes underneath Hull Flats Road, and we have the flood relief channel. So we have 3 water courses all coming together at one location, and the water level in any one of those water courses has the potential to impact on the other. So we have flood defences basically starting in the Mill Hall burn from Mill Hall Gardens, which will be a stone-clad wall around those residential properties. Where it then passes under Smiddy Brae, it changes to a formed concrete wall along the north side of the Mill Hall burn, and then it changes back to a stone-clad wall just around the residential properties around Reddoch Road, and around the stables here we have a formed concrete wall. Moving into Grangemouth town centre itself, this is Zetland Park, the green area, and basically our flood defences start at the children's play park. So along the west side of the Grange burn, we have a stone-clad wall, pretty much continuous from here, and you'll see on the next slide, all the way down to South Shore Road. The flood defences on the east side are predominantly, again, a stone-clad wall, but the section of defence between the children's play park, which is about here, and the existing kiosk in Zetland Park is going to be an earth embankment that's going to be sown with wildflowers to replace the existing wildflower meadow. We will be replacing the 2 bridges, footbridges within Zetland Park, and also replacing Dalratho Road Bridge with a new structure that has solid parapets to retain the flood water. And as we move further north, still on the Grange burn, again, those stone-clad walls continue. When we get to this kind of 90-degree bend in the water course, the flood defence on the north side, which is South Shore Road, again, is going to be an exposed steel pile wall as you're in that industrial area. On the south side of the Grange burn, the stone-clad wall will continue all the way along to Powdrake Road. And Bowness Road, it's just worth mentioning that the existing bridge is going to be retained there, but the parapets are going to be replaced and strengthened to actually contain the flood water, because the predicted depth of flood water is actually higher than the road level at that location. These are the final 2 maps that we're just going to look at, and this is just not going to spend much time on these, just to give some context that we've predominantly talked about the residential areas. This is the industrial areas and the port and petrochemical plant. So this is the River Avon, and we have basically exposed steel piles along both sides of the River Avon. We do have some short or some lengths of a concrete wall where we're going to be using a kind of board pile technique to construct the wall, and we also have a section of a kind of hybrid, which is a part embankment, part steel sheet pile wall just behind the wastewater treatment works. And the final image is of the port area. It also does cover the lower Grange burn, but we've discussed that in previous slides. But around the port, it's primarily an exposed steel pile wall that we'll be constructing and replacing the middle set of gates on the entrance channel into the port. I kind of mentioned, I mentioned that these plans will be available online. In addition to these, we will have some 3D visualizations available both at the in-person events next week and also on the virtual exhibition, and they will also be uploaded to the YouTube channel covering the kind of areas that I've identified there. And I just wanted to give you a kind of quick snapshot of what they will be like. So this is just the entrance into Zetland Park, and this is showing after the works have been complete and the trees that I talked about being felled on Abbots Road have been replaced. But it's just to give you just a quick snippet of what will be available from next week. And at that point, I'm just going to stop for any questions that anyone may have.
Thanks very much, Alan. We've got a few questions in the chats already, and the first question I'm going to come to is Carol Christie's, who's asking about funding, Alistair, and I'm probably going to ask you to answer that. So Carol has asked, what have the Scottish Government committed to in monetary terms at present? Appropriate funding model maybe needs a bit of clarification for lay people like me.
Thanks for that. So when the flood schemes were all prioritised, there was an annual budget set aside to go towards the delivery and implementation of these national flood schemes, prioritised flood schemes. Over the course of progressive time, some of those schemes have cost significantly more than was originally anticipated, and the government is basically looking at their funding that's available and working out how they're going to fund those other projects across the country. But Grangemouth actually is a slightly different case, and we've had a commitment from the Scottish Government that they're going to work specifically with ourselves at Falkirk Council to come up with funding for this scheme, which will presumably sit slightly different to the funding for those other national schemes that are being taken forward. So the funding model that we're looking at might involve, things like Scottish National Infrastructure Bank, investment through that. There's various kind of public-private finance initiatives that may be appropriate, but at this point in time, it's not clear just exactly what the funding model itself will look like. All we can say is that there's a commitment from the council to work with the government, and a commitment from the government to work with us to take this forward. And the task force that's been mentioned by the Cabinet Secretary is the forum that we'll use to come up with the funding that's necessary to take the project forward. That question mark around funding, I was just going to mention, Julie, that question mark around funding doesn't prevent the project moving forward through the current phase. And in a few moments after Alan's finished one or two more slides, I'll go through some slides that show what the next phase is and what the results of that would mean and where we go next. The funding is in place to allow us to proceed with the development at this stage of the project, but the funding isn't currently in place to actually build the project. And that's the little bit that needs big sums of money, but it's the question marks that need to be resolved when we get to that point, or while we get to that point, so that we've got an agreed project to take forward, we've got the funding agreed with Scottish Government, and at that point we can push the button and actually move forward to deliver the defences. Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. And the next question, and I'm sorry I haven't got your name, I've just got initials. So this is probably for you, Alan. Can you explain why we have left a gap between Chapelburn and Glenfillan? And can you confirm that there'll be no displacement issues for those of us without any walls?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I suppose the kind of simple reason that we don't have flood defences in that area is because the existing ground, the land, is already high enough that we don't need flood defences. Flood defences are only being provided in those areas where the ground is lower than the predicted flood level. If the ground is higher than the predicted flood level, then no defences are required. So and to get to that point where we know where to put flood defences, we have done. I've not mentioned it on this call. It's been mentioned on previous engagement events. We have done extensive kind of modelling of the watercourse, which is the process that we look at to basically take the rainfall and turn that into predicted water levels in the watercourses, whether that's from the rainfall events themselves, or whether that's from when you get further downstream, it's from the tide levels, themselves, and we also consider things like waves in that. So we have computer-based models that take all that information and basically give us the predicted levels. So in that location, the questions asked, there is no flood defences needed because the ground levels are actually high enough that the defences aren't required.
Thanks, Alan. And there's just a supplementary to that. The shape of the river and the water flow could cause issues, including erosion. I'm sure you're aware of that, but I don't know whether you want to say anything else before.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the sort of the computer model that I described that uses this. One of the main inputs to that model is information on the shape of the river, because obviously a much wider or river can accommodate higher flow than something that's much smaller. So that is one of the key bits of data that go into that model. There's numerous bits of information that kind of feed into that model, but the shape is a key one. And again, those models don't just tell us how high the water is going to come. They give us information on the velocity, the speed of the water, which is a key thing for us looking at how we can consider if erosion is a risk and whether we need to do anything to combat any erosion. So yeah, that it is something that's considered just as part of the whole process of developing the flood protection scheme.
Thanks, Alan. And the last question in the chat is from Samuel Sweeney, and he's asking, what are the current design level AOD of the proposed defence structures? I'm particularly interested in the area south of Holflats Road.
Yeah, I think we obviously you received your query this afternoon or earlier today on that, and I think that's probably something that the kind of detail is probably best dealt with kind of offline. Again, it is a complex area around there because of the flood relief channel, the Mill Hill burn and River Avon that all have an impact on flood levels there. But I think that's something that I think we'll, at the end, one of the last slide gives kind of contact details that it would be worth just dropping an email to, probably in this case, because I know your queries about potential future development, it's probably best directing that to Falkirk Council's flooding team initially, and they would certainly liaise with the Grangemouth team. But I think the kind of detail of that is probably something that a separate discussion would be the best way of dealing with that, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Alan, and we'll get back to that at the very end of the presentation. I'm not seeing any other hands up and or any hands up on the screen, so I'm just going to ask if there's any more questions before we move on. We'll come back to questions at the end as well. No, I'm not seeing any more hands up, Alan, so I'll let you take us through the last little bit of slides before handing back to Alistair. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Yeah, so I just wanted the next kind of few slides are probably more focused on some of the environmental issues. That a lot of what we've talked about up until now is probably more on the kind of engineering of the scheme, but like any large infrastructure project, or not even large, any project, the kind of environment is key, and that's something that throughout the last 7 or 8 years that it's been spent developing this scheme, the kind of environmental impact is something that has been looked at in parallel. It's not just something that we consider as an add-on just at the end. So that this particular slide just looks at some of the assessments and surveys that have been carried out to feed into that process of understanding the impact on the environment. So we've been carrying out, for over a number of years, extensive land and water habitat surveys so that we understand, what's there just now. We have been undertaking bat surveys for a number of years, looking at both trees, the structures, bridges, the habitat. Is it suitable for bats? And that has involved. Some people may have been aware that we've had surveyors out at dusk and dawn doing surveys, looking at bats when they're emerging, where they're feeding, to understand the kind of pattern of their behaviour. we've been undertaking bird surveys, particularly along the estuary, which is designated a special protection area because of the large numbers of overwintering birds in particular. So we've been carrying out surveys for almost 8 years along the estuary in order that we have, sufficient data to be able to assess the impacts of the proposed works on those birds, and also to look at the kind of proposed mitigation for any impacts. And we've been doing a number of other kind of studies and assessments, and this just covers some of them. And throughout that kind of whole process, there's been a number of kind of key statutory stakeholders involved as well in the scheme. So that's included SEPA, Nature Scot, Historic Scotland, the Marine Directorate, and various others, and they've all been involved at various stages and in various roles as the scheme has been developed. Because of the size and scale of the scheme, and the potential for significant impacts on the environment, the legislation that all of this is done under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009, there is a requirement for us to carry out an environmental impact assessment. Initially, that involves a screening and scoping exercise to determine what are the issues that we should be looking at. The right-hand side of this image just identifies some of those. One or two that are not on that list include air quality and the landscape effects. So all of these things are considered in the environmental impact assessment. We look at any adverse impacts, how we can mitigate those impacts. Some of those impacts are mitigated or they're embedded within the design. An example, kind of simple example, being the desire to reduce the carbon footprint of the project. So embedded within the design is that wherever we are using concrete, we'll be using concrete with a lower cement content to reduce the impacts. But other mitigation can be things such as only carrying out works at certain times of the year, whether that's avoiding, say, work within the river at certain times of the year because of kind of spawning, or whether it's in the case we have here of the work within the Forth Estuary, kind of avoiding completely just certain times of the year. So the kind of winter months when birds are likely to be present or in greater numbers present within the estuary, we'll be looking to just avoid doing any works at that time. Or some of the mitigation just might be controls on the working hours. So all of these things are considered within the environmental impact assessment. They are presented in an environmental impact assessment report, and there is a requirement that that report is published along with all the other scheme documents. So as Alistair will mention shortly, as we work towards the publication of the scheme and the issue of statutory notices, which is the process under the Flood Risk Management Act, the environmental impact assessment report will also be made available at the same time. It's not a small report, it amounts to thousands of pages, but it's obviously a key document in understanding the environmental impacts of the scheme. And just moving on, the last two slides that I've got are really just coming back to this issue of kind of trees, because we know it's a very important issue. As I mentioned earlier, we have done a lot of work to try and avoid impacting trees where possible, and they will only be removed where there's no practical alternative to where the flood defences have to go, that would ultimately impact on the life expectancy of the trees. As everyone will know, trees have roots, and if you cause extensive damage to those roots, either by crushing them or cutting through them, it has an impact on the tree because the kind of the amount of roots a tree has is the amount it needs to be viable to pick up the nutrients in the ground. So if we suddenly cut off half the root system, that tree probably doesn't have enough roots left to continue to be viable, and it might not be something that's apparent straight away. It could take many years, but the life expectancy could be reduced. And also, if we cut through roots, there's an issue of stability of the trees. The roots are the kind of foundations of the tree, and if we were suddenly to remove all the roots on one side, then the tree would be could be prone in high winds to kind of being blown over. So it's there is risks associated with causing damage to the trees, and I say it is a last resort if they have to be removed. Certainly all the trees that are within the area affected by the scheme have been surveyed by independent specialist tree surveyors from I say an independent company, and they have reported on the trees, both the kind of species, the size, the condition of those trees. And whilst it's not, we're not trying to use this as a reason that we're felling trees, but it is just to be clear that some trees that we have found, some are dead already. That's probably evident to people in the summer when there's no leaves on the trees. Some have significant structural defects and could be a danger to the public. They're in urban areas. And like the rest of the Scotland and the UK, a significant amount of ash trees are infected by ash dieback disease, and particularly at Rannoch Park and on Grangemouth Road, the ash trees there are affected, and at Rannoch Park, in particular Rannoch Road, every ash tree is infected with ash dieback. So irrespective of whether this scheme was to go ahead or not, at some point those trees will probably be felled because they will start to become a danger to the public. And I say what we are part of our replanting proposal for trees is that on average we will plant 3 new trees for every tree that's removed. In some areas like Abbots Road, where we're removing large mature trees, the proposal is to plant large specimen replacement. So we'd be planting trees that are 4 to 5 meters high in those locations. We're not proposing to plant kind of small, the kind of small trees that you might buy in your local garden centre. We are proposing to replant, fairly large trees so that they offer that instant, kind of greenery to that area that will be removed. And just moving on to, just kind of my final slide before handing over to Alistair is just really looking at Zetland Park again. So Zetland Park is the image on the bottom left-hand side. It is rotated on this plan, so north is pointing to the right-hand side. But everything that is coloured green on this plan is not going to be affected by the scheme. So these are all the existing trees within the park. There's been rumours that we're affecting all trees in the park. That just is not the case. Within the park itself, which is actually the area to the east of the Grange Burn, there is only 9 trees being felled in there. You can probably just make them. Sorry, I'll just put the laser pointer on. That there's 1 or 2 trees here. Again, 1 or 2 trees just next to the kiosk, and another couple of trees just at the play area. And these are to accommodate, because we're building flood defences at those locations and we're raising the existing footbridges, that will then have to have access ramps, and the trees are being removed to allow us to construct those access ramps. There is trees that will be felled, the red ones, along Abbots Road. As I mentioned earlier, we did look at narrowing Abbots Road, but the kind of feedback from some of the consultees, fire and rescue, and the roads team was that just wasn't a feasible solution. And unfortunately, in that location, because of the lack of kind of space, the trees are already very close to the edge of the road, that they will need to be felled. But I say they will be replaced on a 1x1 replacement with a 4 to 5 metre high tree as close as possible to the existing tree, and what we'll need to have kind of measures in place to ensure that the roots don't adversely impact the flood defences, but they will be replaced. And the image on the right is the continuation from Zetland Park as the bottom left-hand corner, and again, unfortunately, along kind of Abbots Road and Park Road, and along Grangeburn Road, the majority of the trees there need to be felled because there is no space to construct the flood defence walls between the properties that we're trying to protect and the watercourse itself. From people that we've spoke to who live in Grangeburn Road, a worry for them, in addition to these trees being removed, was the visibility that might create of the port on the north side of the Grangeburn. And for that reason, we are looking to retain pretty much all the vegetation on the north side of the watercourse along the edge of, between South Shore Road and the watercourse, in order that it provides that screen until the replacement trees that we plant. Again, every area, where there's a red dot in this plan, there will be a replacement tree planted in that location. But that's, I think, everything that I was going to say, and just pass over to Alistair to cover the last couple of slides.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everybody for sticking with us this far. I promise there's only a couple more slides to go, but they are quite important aspects, and wanted to spend a few moments just to make sure that everybody's clear and aware of the next steps and where we go next. The project will be promoted by Falkirk Council under, as Alan mentioned earlier, the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009. That's the specific legislation that covers works of this nature. And within that legislation, there's this very, very specific requirements and processes and procedures which have to be followed. But essentially, at the end of it, the legislation allows Falkirk Council to seek the necessary legal powers that would be required to move forward and ultimately to undertake any part of the construction works. So none of the construction, none of the defences can happen without going through this statutory process. Back on the 16th of January this year, Falkirk Council Executive Committee approved a request from myself and the project team to commence this legal process. So the scheme notification itself is due to begin in the next couple of months, and I'll just take a few moments to describe the process that's on this slide. Essentially, there's 5 steps. The first step is the publication of notices. So notices must be published in papers. It's quite specific. It has to be in the Edinburgh Gazette and a local paper, which in our instance would obviously be the Falkirk Herald. And it's also displayed around the scheme area, so notices on lampposts and such like as well. But within the legislation, there's also a specific requirement for us to formally notify a specific group of addresses. And these are defined as people that have an interest in land affected by the scheme. Now, affected doesn't necessarily mean that we will be working in somebody's back garden or on somebody's industrial site, but it may just mean that because you're currently at flood risk and you would no longer be at flood risk when the defences are implemented and constructed, that is a positive effect, and you would be therefore considered to be affected by the works. So you would, in that instance, you would get a notification letter through the post. We anticipate that there's around 6,000 to 7,000 addresses that we'll be notifying as part of this process. We're just finalising those numbers at the moment. The notification will be similar to other notices that you might have seen in the past in paper or on lampposts. And as I say, that group of individuals will get a notice through the post. And it might initially look a little bit scary because it's in legal speak and it's got quite a lot of information in it. But essentially what we're trying to do is follow the set process and direct you to where that information can be found for you to review in your own time. So whether you get a notice formally through your post because you're one of those addresses that's considered to be directly impacted, directly affected by the scheme, or whether you're just somebody in the more general vicinity that has an interest in the project, you will still have access to the scheme documents. Scheme documents will be published through the scheme website, be available online, and there will also be hard copies available in at least 2 council offices. That would be the council offices at Falkirk Stadium and the council offices at the Foundry out at Larbert. So that starts the process. From the day the notice appears in the press is day 1. And the second step in there is known as the objection period. And that is a period that we will allow at least 35 days for anybody who wants to object to the process or to the project to formally write to the council with your objection. And the notice that will be published will give you details of where you object, how you do it, and the information you need to include in your objection. Those objections can be submitted either electronically to the email address, and again, that will be provided, or can be by handwritten and in the post to the council addresses. All objections that are received will be acknowledged in writing before they're considered by our legal advisors. And in some instances, an objection might be something that the project team, through discussion with the objector, might be able to resolve. In some instances, it's quite an easy, clear-cut clarification that's required. But obviously, in some other instances, it can be more onerous, more significant. So if it's possible for the project team and the objector to come to an agreement and the objection can be withdrawn, that's great. But that won't always be the case, and there may be some objections that are maintained. So at the end of the objection period, and after a period of time for us to consider those objections and try to resolve as many of those objections as we possibly can, a report will be prepared and submitted to Falkirk Council. That's the third step, the preliminary decision. The council will be asked to make a preliminary decision to do one of 3 things: either confirm the scheme as it stands, to modify the scheme, do something slightly different in one or more places, or to reject the scheme entirely. And that is a decision that Falkirk Council members will be asked to make. If that preliminary decision is made, once that preliminary decision is made, it's highly likely that will be notified. It will have to be notified to Scottish ministers. And at that point, if there are maintained objections that haven't been resolved, Scottish ministers have 2 choices. They can either direct the council to hold a local hearing with those objectors, or they can hold a wider public local inquiry, which would be chaired by a reporter and would go through a formal process to hear the objections, and the reporter would then independently come to a conclusion on what the outcome of that inquiry should be. So the final decision on this project can only be made in one of 2 ways. Either there have been no objections that are maintained and the council can reach a preliminary and then subsequently a final decision, or there are objections which have resulted in the requirement to have a local hearing or a public local inquiry, and at the outcome of those processes, only at that point would there be a final decision. So I think it's quite obvious that the timescale to get through this is a bit of an unknown. Neither anybody in the project team on our side can predict what objections are coming in, and nobody on the public side will know how many other objections are going to be submitted. And it will depend on which course of action needs to be taken during this process, just exactly how long that will take from start to finish. Our best guess is that at the very earliest we would get through that process would be around the end of this calendar year, beginning of next calendar year. But if it was required to go to a public local inquiry, it's highly likely that would take 2, 3, 4 years to go through that process. So it's very flexible, very fluid, very, very varied. And Alan, if we can just go to the next slide, please. This just begins to put all of where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading to into a simple timeline and give it some context. So This slide's divided into kind of 3 sections. On the left, there's everything in the past, starting with identifying the scheme and all the work we've done over recent years, collecting data and working up the outline design. And that includes a number of public consultation events dating back from 2018. A lot of the letter drops we've done to the communities, encouraging people to sign up for newsletters and to look at the scheme website and sign up to our social media channels to be more informed of what information is available. To date, we've issued 7 newsletters to the community. Those started way back in, I think it was the winter of 2021 was the first one, and the 7th one's just been issued very recently. In that period, we've also ran our STEM activity with local schools. That started in spring 2022. It was repeated in spring 2023 with the primary schools. And I think we've managed to reach just about every primary school within the scheme area to date. And we also then extended that to Grangemouth High School last October and ran a really successful event with the pupils at Grangemouth High. We've also had, we've erected scheme notice boards around the scheme area to make people aware of the proposals and where they can find more information. And where requested, we've had one-to-one consultations with a number of individual residential properties or with commercial businesses. So there has been quite a big effort over the timescale to try and engage with the public and try and make sure the public are informed of the timelines and where things are generally headed towards. That then brings us to the centre part of the slide, starting with the event tonight and the events next week, which is the engagement events. And over the within the next month and a half, we will commence the statutory process that was outlined and I described in a little bit of detail on the previous slide. But as I said, that process, anywhere between 9 and 36 months. Your guess is as good as mine. Nobody can predict how long that process will take because it is dependent on the scale, the number, the nature of those number of objections that may or may not come in. So once we've gone through that statutory process and there's a confirmed scheme and a final decision has been made on a confirmed scheme, that isn't the end of the story, unfortunately. At that point, we will only then commence the detailed design work to finalise those foundations that we showed on the earlier plan. The heights of the walls are all confirmed and known, but the detail and the structural specification of those walls hasn't been drawn up yet because there's no point in doing that until we get to that stage. And alongside detailed design, we may start doing some of the more enabling work. So there may be areas where public utilities would be affected by new walls or embankments. So there can be enabling works to divert those utilities prior to the main contract works commencing. Or there may be elements of the environmental works where there's trees to be removed or new tree planting to be installed in advance of the works commencing. So there's elements that can be developed in that period. And that leads up to those construction activities. And as I alluded to earlier, it is anticipated, given the 28 kilometres or 17 miles of defences, we wouldn't be doing that in one contract or one phase. That would be split over 4 or 5 separate construction packages that would be programmed sequentially. So we would do one area and move into the next area. We wouldn't be working everywhere at once. We would gradually work from one end to the other and progress our way through that. And that process, obviously, as I alluded to earlier as well, will be dictated to as the budget is made available from Scottish Government and other funding partners. So I hope that just gives you a flavour of the journey we've been on, where we are currently, and unfortunately, we're not at the end of that story yet. There's still a way to go. So I'd just like to, before I hand over to Julie, just thank everybody for their attention and look forward to responding to any questions that come up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and we'll just quickly take you through just some of the other activities that we've talked about later that start next week. So if you know anyone who hasn't been able to get online today and wanted to join us, there are the 5 in-person events all over the scheme area that start next week and run till Friday, and we'll just post some of those dates in the chat so you can just see them. There will also be a virtual exhibition, so if you can't make any of the in-person events, you'll be able to see the same information online that you've seen today. That will also mean you'll be able to scroll in, zoom into the maps that you've seen to get a better understanding. And at both the in-person events and in that virtual exhibition, there'll be a feedback form about the exhibitions that you've seen, and we'd welcome you if you want to give us some feedback. So if you've been online, you can't come along in person, please look out for that survey that will be in the virtual exhibition. The exhibition opens at 4 o'clock on Monday at the same time as we're starting the very first engagement event. It will be open until the 15th of March. You can also come back online if there's other things that you think about later and you haven't asked today. Our second online session, which is on the 11th of March, and you can register in the same way as you've done for this session. All the information will be on the website that's in front of you. You can get any of the information from the QR codes, and Alan's just putting that out, and we'll put that in the chat as well. That's all available on all our information, so please take time to look at it. If you've had if you want to have a chat, and a couple of people have asked to have some online conversations this evening, then you can email us at the email address that's in front of you. Just make sure you give us your name and address in that email, and then we can arrange to speak to you about the issues that you want to discuss. No, there's nothing else to say this evening apart from if anybody else has any other questions that they want to ask now, or put your hand up. And I can see that we do have a hand up. Charlie's got his hand up, and we'll come to you now, Charlie. But if you just raise your hands, if you've got your camera on, or your online hand, or put something else in the chat, we'll just take a bit of time now to allow you to just ask a couple of questions. I'm sorry we've run over, but I think it's probably important that we get to those questions. Charlie, do you want to come on? And you've got your hand up. Do you want to just take your mute button
Yes,
off
please.
and just ask your question, please?
Yeah, I think my mute button's off, is it? Can you hear me?
It is. Yes, we can indeed.
Yeah. Okay, a bit concerned towards the end there when it was explained that things would not be done sequentially. Surely it would be quicker if you started the various work fronts much about the same time. I realise it'd be a major project, but if it's going to be start at one end and follow the other, it's going to take a lot longer, surely.
Alistair, do you want to come back first, and Alan can maybe follow
Yeah, I'll
you?
come in on that, no problem. Yeah, you know, we've actually looked at constructing the defences in a number of ways, and there's a number of considerations in there. You know, some of that is around which areas could be affected at the same time. You know, you could work in industry and you could work in residential areas with not a lot of impact between the two. But part of it is also around flood risk as well, because as you construct the defences, you can be temporarily moving the flood risk from one location to another. So it's generally preferable to start at the upstream end and put those defences in as you go along and work your way downstream. So there's a number of ways we've looked at it. The plans could change, but again, it will largely depend on the availability of budgets to actually take each of those construction projects forward. For us as a client team, there's a resource impact on us managing multiple work fronts, so that needs to be a consideration. It's not impossible, but it's obviously another one of the considerations that we want to be able to give residents in one community just as much attention as we can in somewhere else. And if there's too many things going on at once, that becomes a little bit more difficult to manage. So there's been a number of elements thought of that, and as I say, the plans could evolve and change as we move towards that construction date.
Yeah, well, that's fine. That answers my question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlie. So we'll just pause now and just ask if there's any other questions, any other hands up. I'm not seeing any other hands up, and I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So I'll just give you a minute. If there's anything you think of, I've put in the chat, you'll see the email address that you can send anything into. You can also call the contact number for Falkirk Council, and they'll put you through to the right person, or they'll take a message and pass it on to the team, and the team will come back to you. So there's lots of ways to get in touch with us. The best places to start is on the website, where all the information is. All this information will be loaded up there once we've finished the in-person events. And if you can make it along to any of those events, we'd really love to see you and have individual conversations with you. So I'll just pause now to see if there's any further questions. No, I'm not seeing any further hands. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm sorry we've taken a long time to go through all the maps and all the different areas and everything that the scheme includes. I think you'll probably have found that worthwhile. Remember, you can go on to the virtual exhibition when it opens and zoom in and have a good look yourself, answer the survey if you wouldn't mind, that would be helpful. And we hope to see some of you at the in-person events. Thanks very much for your time this evening, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
June, can you stop the recording, please?
Just stopped it. Just checking.